4th Senate District, which is basically the Rockford area. I served as chairman of the local journalism task force, which has been meeting for the past 6 months. I'm also a former TV reporter myself. We've heard from experts the past 6 months and listened to media outlets, both big and small, looking at what many feel is a crisis impacting the future of local news. It's a topic that affects each of you in this room, your employer, and the ability of readers, listeners, and viewers to get the news and information they need on a daily basis. News outlets are closing or shrinking at an alarming rate because of technological and financial disruption. Take a look at the visual displays in front of you. Newsroom employment in this country has dropped 26% in the last 15 years. Illinois has lost 232 newspapers since 2005. The state has lost 85% of its newspaper journalists, the highest percentage in the country. In the other display, 5 of Illinois' 102 counties have no local source of news, and 33 rely on just one single source of news. In too many towns, no one is covering local city council meetings, no one is covering local school board meetings. So, how can residents know what's going on? How do residents and voters make informed decisions if they don't know what's going on in the communities? It hurts the fabric of these communities and the democratic process. You may ask, why should government care or do something about this? Task force members believe an informed citizenry is essential to the health of our local governments, both national and local. Reliable information is becoming endangered, and too often misinformation on social media is taking its place. Media outlets, especially newspapers, are undergoing major business model changes. That happens in the private sector. But the task force believes there are things state government can do to help improve the finances of local news outlets and incentivize the hiring of local reporters. Some of the suggested policies range from different types of tax credits to grant programs. Also, a lot of the advertising revenue that has gone to big tech companies that use content from local news sources. So another proposal would allow media companies to negotiate collectively with the tech giants and create a revenue stream for local newsrooms. I think one line in the final report that's been distributed to you really describes the situation perfectly. The local news crisis isn't just a business problem, it's a democracy problem as well. We have a number of speakers with prepared remarks, and we'll begin with Tim Franklin, who's with the Medill School of Journalism with Northwestern University.
Thank you, Senator, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. There's a crisis in local news in the U.S. that's accelerating, and it has far-reaching implications for communities, for their residents, and indeed for democratic institutions. And sadly, Illinois is one of the hardest hit states in the nation. The U.S. has lost almost 2,900 newspapers since 2005, 2,900. And the nation is losing 2.5 newspapers every single week, according to the research at the Medill Local News Initiative at Northwestern. There are now 204 entire counties in the U.S. that are local news deserts with no local news source whatsoever. And 1,558 counties only have one remaining news source, according to the annual report that we published at the end of last year. Medill researchers also have done predictive modeling that shows that 228 counties across the U.S. are now at high risk of becoming news deserts. This is a serious problem, and it's accelerating. Now, as you heard from the senator, the local news crisis is affecting Illinois communities and residents more than most. Illinois has lost more newspaper journalists than any state in the nation. In raw numbers, about 2,300 newspaper journalists have been lost, many of them as a result of industry consolidation and chain ownership of local news outlets that's prevalent throughout Illinois. This is a crisis that's affecting all of Illinois. I want to make that point in counties across the state. About half of the newspaper losses have been in the Chicagoland area, especially in suburban communities, according to the research that we've done at Northwestern. There are 5 Illinois counties that are local news deserts: Alexander, Edwards, Hamilton, Perry, and Pulaski. Medill has put 4 additional Illinois counties on its watch list of counties at high risk of becoming news deserts. Those are Brown, Gallatin, Hardin, and Pope. And 33 other counties only have one local news source. So I get asked the question a lot, so why does this matter? It matters because research done outside of Northwestern has now shown that the loss of local news results in a decline in civic participation, lower turnout in local and state elections, fewer candidates seeking public office. It results in increased government spending, in increased borrowing costs, and unfortunately, there's some research that shows increased corruption in local communities as well. Research also has shown that in news desert areas, residents turn to local social media sources. So what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with people being civically engaged. The problem is that many of these social media platforms are filled with disinformation and misinformation that just proliferates, and it's exacerbating the partisan divides that we have in this country. If these trends are not reversed, Illinois communities will suffer the consequences. They'll have less accountability of their local governments. They'll be less informed about the activities of their officials, their schools, their businesses, their cultural institutions, and they'll feel even more disconnected and polarized than they already do. Now, there are a number of bright spots in local news in Illinois. This is not all gloom and doom by any means. There are news organizations that every day are innovating and experimenting with new models. Philanthropists, including several major Illinois foundations, are stepping up in a big way to support local news. That's all terrific, and it gives me hope for the future. But this is a major, systemic, and urgent problem. This crisis is to news and information what climate change is to the environment, a historic, existential, but solvable challenge for our times. And if you'd like additional information on any of the stats that I've rattled off today, you can find our local news report at Local News Initiative at northwestern.edu. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Sam Fisher. Sam is the former president and CEO of the Illinois Press Association. Sam, take it away.
All right, thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
First off, I'd like to thank the senator for bringing this legislation forward. It was tremendous, and it's being done in other states across the country. But the fact that he was able to bring this forward and create the task force, and the task force was comprised of some very, very talented people. And there was a considerable amount of discussion, and the task force relied on people from outside sources to get information. As Tim said, I'm the retired president and CEO of the Illinois Press Association that serves approximately 400 newspapers. So that probably makes it an association that comprises more local newsroom than anything else. And I can tell you during COVID, we did everything we could to keep papers motivated and going, and it was tough, but many of them have survived. I also know that just since the first year, there's been other changes in the newspaper business as it applies to Illinois in terms of reduction of frequency of print production or print publications. Quincy has gone to 2 days a week, the Herald Whig, and I just read this week that Kankakee has dropped in addition to. In addition to those people restricting their circulation in terms of print publication, we're seeing a lot of papers combine and merge with others, and there's a lot of group ownership as well too. Prior to becoming president and CEO of the Illinois Press Association, I was a community newspaper for 25 years as a publisher. It's one of the best jobs in the world, and I can tell you firsthand the value of a local newspaper and the impact it has on its community. In small towns, and many of us have lived in small towns, we've seen small towns go the way because they have lost the local bank, if they were fortunate to have a local hospital, and other institutions. And the newspaper is one of those institutions that's extremely important. Tim alluded to a really important point that I would like to make is that people need to be informed, but they need to be informed from credible sources and from people they know. So when people are informed, citizenry is informed, they're engaged, and that's what makes a great community. And I'm fortunate to live in a very engaged community in Princeton, Illinois, but it takes a strong local media outlet, in this case newspapers, to carry that on. So this legislation that we have proposed, policy, not necessarily legislation, but policy that we proposed, is being done and introduced in other states. Unfortunately, a lot of this legislation was introduced federally, and unfortunately, nothing's happening federally, and so we're hopeful that we can get some momentum here at the state. And again, I want to thank the senator for bringing this forward because this is an extremely important issue, not only to the industry, but to our communities. And there's a bunch of communities across the state of Illinois that rely on their local newspaper. I'd like to introduce Jenna Dooley, and she is the past president of the Illinois News Broadcasters Association.
Yes.
Duly noted.
That's right. I am a radio broadcaster, so I've got 45 seconds, subject, verb, object prepared, maybe. Again, it was an honor to serve on this task force on behalf of the Illinois News Broadcasters Association. We're a nonprofit organization that trains and supports broadcast journalists, students, and educators around the state. Many of our reporters serve in downstate markets, often in news deserts. It isn't easy work, but it lies at the cornerstone of a healthy democracy. We are aware of the challenges facing our industry, but these recommendations focus on a range of possible solutions. I work in both the newsroom and a classroom, and I've seen a lot of talent in the Illinois pipeline. Our state's news outlets offer some of the best hands-on training out there, dedicated to ethical and innovative journalism, and I believe it's worth additional investment. These recommendations acknowledge the crisis while connecting a few dots on the assets and opportunities in front of us as a state. I'm eager to see how these recommendations are received and, most importantly, what additional ideas they generate. Thank you.
As a former TV reporter, I appreciate the ability of someone to get a message across in 45 seconds. So as Sam mentioned and Jenna referred to, the next step is obviously the introduction legislation. I'll be filing a bill in the next couple of days, not mirroring the recommendations of the task force, but including many of the things that you'll see on the list of things that the task force believes would be helpful to improving the financial situation. So I'll be introducing that in the next couple of days. Fortunately, we had a wide range of people on the task force, people, journalists, people representing journalistic groups, members of government, both sides of the party, and the academic world as well. Fortunately, Senator Don DeWitt was a member of the task force, and we had some interesting conversations about philosophy of government and the role of media. And so I'd like to, as we move forward with the legislative process in the months ahead, I'd like to have Senator DeWitt make a few comments as well.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning, everyone. State Senator Don DeWitt, 33rd Senate District, covering Kane, McHenry, and DuPage counties. First of all, I want to thank Senator Stottlemyre for his bipartisan approach in this process. Some of you I've had a chance to spend a little bit of time with are aware that I actually grew up in a journalism household. My mother was a local newspaper reporter for over 20 years before becoming an editor for what at that time was the St. Charles Chronicle, now the Kane County Chronicle, part of the Shaw Media Organization. So I'd like to think I have a pretty good understanding, but more importantly, an appreciation for the work of journalists. And I'm aware and sympathetic to the struggles, financial, personal, professional, and otherwise, that today's newspapers are facing. I was proud to serve as the Senate Republican representative on this local journalism task force, and I believe there was a very respectful and productive exchange of ideas that took place over the last 10 months. There is no denying, and someone mentioned it earlier, that an informed constituency is essential to the health of our government, both locally and nationally. But as a governing body like this legislature, I believe we need to proceed very cautiously on this issue. Involving ourselves with Illinois' system of journalism and the kinds of news people read is not an issue that should be taken lightly. We need to be very careful about the kind of process that we may be all stepping into. This legislature has a habit of pushing through laws and policies within this state without fully examining what the unintended consequences of those policies might be. There are many examples of legislation that has been passed in this building only to face a series of constitutional court challenges or subsequent multiple trailer bills to correct problems that have developed after the fact. This issue of journalistic integrity is too important to face a similar outcome. Free speech is enshrined in the Bill of Rights, and that guaranteed freedom must guide these discussions and decisions as we move forward. I have additional concerns about just who may have the ability or the right to determine what may or may not be considered reliable journalism. Legislators in this body are elected for 2- and 4-year terms in the House and Senate, respectively. Are we comfortable allowing individuals who only serve on a temporary basis in this legislature making those types of decisions? Ultimately, should anyone have the ability to decide what we should be reading and which newspapers or mediums we might have available to the public to access that news, and who should qualify potentially for those state subsidies? When state funding is involved, I fear there is a real chance that those who receive these subsidies may feel indebted to their grantor. Regardless of which political party may be in control of the political agenda in this state. In closing, these are all issues that I believe are worthy of additional discussion, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. I just want to be sure, particularly as we head into another election season here in Illinois, that any decisions we make may have an effect on our constitutional liberties, and that they are being made for all of the right reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the comments. I mean, the goal here is to get local reporters covering local meetings. Trying to avoid the politics. We just need people on the ground covering what's going on in the community so people in those towns and communities know what's going on. That's driving the process. We're trying to avoid the politics, want to work in a bipartisan efforts, but we don't have as many local reporters as we've had in the past and that we need in the future. So happy to answer questions. Any of us can answer any questions you may have.
Can you kind of, speak to, Senator DeWitt's comments there, just about making sure that whatever policies come up is respecting that separation between us and you, so there's not that First Amendment issue or that appearance that we're, as Senator said, kind of in debt to the people giving us the money?
Well, again, the goal is to help incentivize local reporters on the ground. And probably Tim Franklin can address this better than I can, but government has always been involved in the distribution and funding of local news. We deal with public broadcasting these days because the private market doesn't always fill those niches that may be underserved when it comes to news markets. So we're seeing underserved areas in this community. So obviously, when we want news information and reliable news information, I think there is a role for state government to help facilitate that. But government's always had a role in the distribution of news, and maybe I'd like to have Tim address that briefly as well.
Thank you, Senator, and thanks for the question. Government has been subsidizing news going back almost to the beginning of our republic through subsidizing the mailing of newspapers out to people. So this is not a new issue by any means. Also, in many states, most states, public broadcasting receives some subsidy, often small or too small, from state governments as well. And this is also common in other parts of the world, including in Europe, for there to be some kind of a government support for local news. Look, I spent most of my life and career in news. I was skeptical of government involvement in news. I think we're at a point where there are ways this can be done carefully and thoughtfully. And where it's left up to consumers to decide. So some of the subsidies, for example, that are mentioned in the report are things like tax credits for people who subscribe to local news organizations. That's consumer choice. It's not the government deciding who gets money. Tax credits for small businesses. It's up to the small business to decide whether they want to advertise in local news. That's not a politician making that decision. So there are ways to thoughtfully do this. As was mentioned earlier, there's legislation pending or passed in 13 states. So this is also something that other parts of the country are looking at and reviewing. There are 3 municipalities around the country that have also taken action to try to help local news. So this is becoming a bigger and wider issue. And I'm not here to endorse any specific legislation, but we are at a crisis point, and something needs to be done.
How the private space is competition, right? If you have a solid news team, they're able to hit the streets and, you know, dig up stuff. I mean, even here in Springfield, there's a group called Springfield Leaks that, you know, they get police reports, and they're the first ones to report on, you know, really controversial, crimes and whatnot, really in-depth reporting. How do you address that competitive nature if you're going to start possibly giving credits to some who may be floundering while others who are thriving are doing their own thing?
I think we're fortunate if we have a situation, any type of media market. We're really talking about underserved areas that have no source of local news, where there's not competition. Nobody's covering anything. That's the issue we're trying to address here. The platforms are changing. How people are gathering news are changing with the new technological advances. We're encouraging that. We want to incentivize those types of ventures. We're not picking and choosing here. We're just trying to get more boots on the ground, more local reporters, whatever the platform may be, in whatever capacity they're distributing news. So I think we're focused on all those red areas that are not from people who are not getting any coverage right now. That's the focus of this legislation, and we're trying to do that through, I think, innovative ways that don't necessarily pick or choose, but just incentivize more of a good thing, more reporters on the ground. Anybody else want to take a crack at that one?
We did spend time during our meetings kind of noodling over, do we put out what is the definition of a journalist? Do we put out a line? And what was helpful is the speakers that we brought in who have experience in this in other states, who have either worked on policy or legislation. And while we didn't ultimately come out with what defines a journalist, you will see in the report that there's recommendations that within any potential legislation, there are safeguards that journalists should not be devoted to a specific outcome while enduring the systematic processes of journalism. Okay, it's a little wordy, but ultimately there are some benchmarks, some easy ones to prevent any bad actors who would try to benefit or leverage this. Related to content, audience, employment, and business standing. So while the task force ultimately in Illinois did not define a journalism, we do have some precedent in other states that have already looked at this question, and they consulted us during this process.
Would that include solution journalism? I know that's a term that's used in some areas that you know, you kind of look at the solution, then you write the story getting to that solution.
So the Solutions Journalism Network has a framework that talks about, okay, maybe there's an issue happening in the community you're serving, and there's another community that's made a dent in it or something. So you kind of point to, hey, this is happening in Rockford or Carbondale. In Louisville, they did this. One of the tenets of solutions journalism is also to talk about the limitations of that. So not to just be an open cheerleader of a solution, but also talking about, so you've got the solution, you've got the evidence to back up why it was working, as well as some potential limitations that it might encounter within your community. So I think best practice of solutions journalism doesn't just give kind of a free pass to something that's working in one place that might not necessarily be the best fit in a local community here in Illinois.